The question I get asked more than any other is what amp or amps do I actually recommend? People see the amps that I point out flaws in, things that catch on fire, things that are common failure points, things to avoid, things to look for, but they want to know what amps on the market do I actually recommend. And it's usually asked just, hey, what amp do you recommend? I don't know whether you're playing country, jazz, blues, heavy metal, whatever. I don't know your budget. I don't know your stage volume needs. So I'm going to do a series on these. And this first video, as you can see from the title, is amps under 500. So to get started, I did what just about anyone would do these days. I went to Reverb. Now, I'm not endorsing Reverb, and any particular listings that I show later in this video, I'm not endorsing those sellers. I went to Reverb because I can show you new prices and used prices. You can see shipping. We'll get into some of those details later, new versus used and shipping considerations. It gives a good overview of what's on the market. It's what most people would do. So that's going to be the big box guys like Sweetwater, it's going to be mom and pop stores, and it's going to be individual sellers. So I went to Reverb and I clicked on pedals and amplifiers eventually. And then I went to guitar combos. And that's important because most people in this price range need a combo. So I went to all listings. I don't care about the brand and the filtering. I decided to go 225 to 500. That's a pretty good range. Anything below 225 is not going to be worth your money. That's just reality. And then I went to ships to and ships from continental US. That's going to be US specific, but adjust for your region or for your own region. The prices are going to be roughly comparable from country to country. Like that PV Classic 50? No, not anymore. More on that later. Let's look at that Blackstar HT Club 40. That's one of the most popular amps on the market. And we'll just add that to our list for comparison. Now let's get into the amps that I actually chose for this list. So after setting those filters, there are a little over 3,000 amps from which to choose. Now, I did not go through all 3,000 listings. I did go through the first 20 pages or so. I began to see that it was the same amps over and over again. But after going through all that, I found 7 amps that I've had direct experience of, kind of, sort of. We'll talk about that in a moment. These 7 amps are not the 7 amps I recommend. These are the 7 amps for consideration, and we'll narrow that down depending on your needs. Some of you might be surprised to see that 2 of the 7 amps I chose are solid-state modeling amps, the Boss Katana and the Line 6 Catalyst. The others are tube amps. The Rod Deluxe, I think it's the #1 selling tube amp of all time. The Blues Junior is not far behind. The Vox, the Marshall, very strong contenders in this price range. The Blackstar HT Club 40 is a very popular amp model in this price range, and the next one up to $1,000. A lot of players are choosing the Blackstar. We'll see if it makes the cut. This list is also interesting in another way in that the 2 modelers, the Katana and the Line 6 Catalyst, can be had brand new under $500. That can be the 50 watt or the 100 watt Katana. That can be the 60 watt, the 100 watt, or the 200 watt Catalyst, all under $500, brand new, with warranty, shipped to you. We'll talk about the pros and cons of the modeling stuff in a little bit. On the tube side, every one of these amps is a used listing. And that's good and bad, as we'll get into. But, every one of these amps is well over $500. Some of them around $1,000 new. But you can get them used for under $500 or just at $500. With those amps, typically because the amps are being sold used and amps weigh a lot, there's very rarely free shipping. Sometimes there's no shipping available at all. So it'd be local pickup only, which is not necessarily a bad thing if you live near if you live in an area where you can actually have local listings. If you're out in the middle of Montana, that might not be great, but a lot of us have access to local markets. So if it's one town over or just another part of the city, you can go and do local pickup, which means that you can play the amp before buying it. So that's a good thing for local pickup. You can visually inspect it, you can play it, you can ask questions. I would urge you to try to look inside the cabinet of a used tube amp. Look at the board if possible. It's not always easy. On the Hot Rod, it's easy. On the Blues Junior, it's easy. The Custom, it's easy. The Marshall and the Blackstar, it's not. None of the Reverb listings I saw for any of these amps, and I looked through a few dozen for each amp model trying to find gut shots. No one's showing the inside of these amps. And I'll talk about some things that you need to look for, particularly on the hot rod and the blues in a moment. So that's this list sorted into modelers versus tubes. A more useful way to look at things is repairability. So here I've got the amps which are repairable, and for those that I'm calling limited repair. And notice the Blackstar has changed columns. It's no longer along with its two buddies. It's over in the limited repair column with the solid state stuff. What do I mean by limited repair? The Boss, the Line 6, the Blackstar are all selling a lot of features at a very low price point. One of the ways they do that is they have very inexpensive boards with what's called surface mount components on them, and they're very easy to manufacture. They're very difficult to repair at a component level. They don't do component level repairs on these under warranty. If you have a problem with one of these while it's under warranty, the authorized service center will swap the entire board. It costs less for the company to change out a board than to pay someone to fix what's wrong with any individual board. And so the entire concept behind making these to get these to market at a certain price is that, okay, that board's not going to last forever, but that's okay, we'll throw a new one at it. And that's actually fine when the amp's under warranty. Once the warranty expires, can you get the board? You can get the Blackstar boards. I don't think you can get the Boss Katana boards unless you are a Boss authorized service center. And then once it's out of warranty, you're going to have to pay a lot extra for that. And there's another issue which is going to affect you, and that's a concept called end of life, end of product life. So right now, somewhere in a warehouse, there's a whole bunch of Blackstar HT Club 40 main boards. Will they still be there and available for sale in 5 years? Will the company still have replacement components for these boards in 5 years, 10 years? Fender has screwed a lot of players over in the last 15 years with their various XD modeling apps, where the DSP card dies. Well, they stopped making those DSP cards because they came up with a new model. And then you have this old amp that you just cannot get the board for unless you buy another amp and cannibalize it. So with the Boss Katana, the Line 6, the Blackstar 2, there's a certain window where you can use this amp and you'll have support. And once that window expires, the amp may or may not be repairable. So if you know that going in, you say, okay, I'm going to buy that 100-watt catalyst or that 100-watt Katana for $450. And if I get 3 to 4 years out of that, that's what I need it to do. And then I'll get something else. So it's not terrible. It's less terrible on the Katana and the catalysts that are under $500 new. The Blackstar is more than $500 new. You do the math on that. I would say of these amps already, I would recommend the Marshall DSL-40C over the Blackstar. It's better built, it's repairable. They have very similar sounds available. But, I can't tell you what amp to buy. We'll talk more about the individual models later. In the repairable camp, all these tube amps, with the exception, all the tube amps on the right, not the Blackstar, these are all designed to have component level repair. If one resistor fails, that one resistor can be replaced. If something goes wrong, it can be fixed. If you take care of your amp, if you have it serviced, or even just have a tech look it over every 2 or 3 years, these things can last 10, 15, 20 plus years, some of them more than others. We'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the individual amps later. I will say it's a good thing that the Hot Rod and the Blues Junior are repairable because they always need repair. That said, and more to come on that, once certain repairs are done to those two models, they can last for decades. They're just not inclined to do so as they come from the factory. Here are the pros and cons of solid-state modeling amps as I see them. And some of you might be surprised for me to say that there are pros, but there definitely are. In 2022, at this price point, under $500, a solid-state modeling amp can be a very good choice for a lot of people. The thing I want to talk about here, you can read the rest of this. I don't need to read all this for you. You can pause it if you need to take time. And if you have any questions that I'm not addressing here, put them in the comments. But low cost per watt, that's why I have it in parentheses. Now it's true, solid state always gives you more output wattage for the same price. You get $450, you can buy the 15-watt AC15 or the 40-watt Marshall DSL-40, or you can get the 100-watt or 200-watt solid-state modeling amps. So if you're only need is to be as loud as possible for as little money. Solid state has a leg up there. That said, in real world use, there's not a huge difference between a 25 watt amp and a 50 watt amp, or a 50 watt amp and a 100 watt amp. If you double the power, you don't double the output. More on that later. That might be a different video. But just because you have a 100 watt amp solid state, it does not mean that it's going to be that much perceptibly louder than a 60 watt tube amp, etc., etc. People don't understand how loud 15 watts can be. That's why the Blues Junior and the AC15 are still on this list, along with 100 watt and 200 watt amps. They're loud enough to play with a drummer. The pros and cons of tube amps, and it may surprise some of you to hear me say that there are cons, but there definitely are. Again, you can read this. I don't need to read it all for you. Pause it if you need to. If you have any questions about anything on here, put it in the comments. Now, longer life in general, and at this price point, a tube amp can have a longer life because it's repairable and because they're generally better built. They have to be, because the transformers for tube amps weigh a lot. So you have a heavy transformer, you need to have a sturdier chassis. That chassis with its transformers weighs more, so you have to have a sturdier cab. In the amps that are done right, that's true. It's not really the case across the board for the Blues Junior, but we'll get to that. Classic Sounds is a little nebulous, a little vague, a little subjective. That's why I have it in quotes. But the longer you play, the more you realize that not only does a 60s deluxe reverb not sound at all like a 50s deluxe, which doesn't sound like a 50s Bassman, which doesn't sound like a JTM45, which doesn't sound like a Marshall Super Lead, you'll also realize that the deluxe reverb does not sound like the Vibrolux reverb, does not sound like the Pro reverb, does not sound like the Super reverb. And so when a modeling amp says this is a 60s Fender sound, it may be quite good, but it might not be the sound you're chasing. If you really want that sound, if you really want to sound like Danny Gatton, you need to have a Vibrolux reverb. You can sound quite good with a deluxe reverb, but you won't have quite the same thing. Modeling amps have not quite gotten to that point. They can get you to the point where it sounds pretty much like you're playing through some sort of 60s Fender, at least at this price point. We're ignoring the Kempers and the profiles and the impulses and all that stuff. We're talking under $500. So you're going to have a Fender clean, and it may be okay, but it won't necessarily be the ideal sound. Simpler circuits, simpler is better. That goes across the board. More tone per watt, another one I have in quotes. There's a misconception that tube watts are louder than solid state watts. That's not what's going on. A watt is a watt. It's a measurement of energy. What is real is that if you honestly measure an amp's output, you're measuring at the onset of distortion or of clipping. And a solid state amp, once it clips, it's useless. It sounds horrible. So if it says 60 watts, that's as loud as it can go without sounding awful. A tube amp, however, sounds good past the point of clipping. In fact, a lot of amps that we perceive as being clean are actually clipping and distorting just slight ways, and that makes the sound very exciting to us. So if I measure a tube amp, I might say, okay, at the onset of distortion, it's 16.5 watts. That may be 4 or 5 on the volume knob. You turn it up, that amp may put out 25 to 30 watts at its peaks, at the most. But you cannot sell that amp as a 30 watt amp because you have to measure at the onset of clipping. So what happens is you set a tube amp and a solid state amp to the same volume. That solid state amp is clean, doesn't sound quite as interesting to our ears as the tube amp at the same volume, which has distortion happening. We're just not perceiving it as distortion. It's just more harmonically rich, more interesting to the ear, and certain frequencies get accentuated in ways that we like. So the perception is that the more interesting sound, which has slight distortions to it, is louder, grabs our attention more. That's how our brains are wired. As modeling amps get better and better, and even at this price point, they're getting to the point where this is less of an argument, that perception of tube watts versus solid state watts is going to become less of a thing. At certain price points, it may not even be a thing anymore. 10 years from now, probably they'll have the modeling down pat. It won't be an issue, but it's something to be aware of. So a 15 watt tube amp can be a great choice against a 50 watt solid state modeling amp, particularly now that we have to keep our volumes down. If you have a 100 watt solid state amp, but you have to keep the master volume on 3, you're right there where the AC15 will be. You're right there where the Blues Junior would be. In fact, the Blues Junior AC15 can potentially be louder than the 100 watt amp with the master volume on 3. It's just something to be aware of. The other thing I want to talk about here is that they usually hold their value, especially if you buy them used, and harder to outgrow. If you have a Deluxe Reverb, you're not going to be worried that the new version of Deluxe Reverb has USB 3. You're not going to be worried that the new version has FireWire or plugins or an app that lets you control it from your phone. It's a Deluxe Reverb. You've got it. You're going to be pretty satisfied at some point. You might change out the speaker, but the amp will suit your needs. A good tube amp that really does a certain thing well will always be useful. All right, let's move on to the individual amps for consideration here. All right, let's start with the modeling amps. Now, I have no preference for the Line 6 versus the Boss. In fact, of the amps on this list, the Line 6 Catalyst series is the only one that I've not had in on the bench. They're just too new. But construction-wise, in terms of quality and longevity, it's a toss-up between the Line 6 and the Boss stuff. Either one can be fine for a certain amount of time. But you know, if you need something that's very flexible and lightweight, etc., it ticks all your boxes, and you spend $400 and you get 4 or 5 years out of it, that $400 per year is about the same or less than what we pay for Netflix, etc., etc. It can be a good investment. Just know that it is not a long-term investment. As to which model is better, that's going to come down to which ones you like the features of, which ones you like the sounds of. So go look at one, play one, look at all the specs, do some research, make as informed a decision as you can make. I'm not here to say it's good or bad. I'm here to say it is an option at this price point that may suit your needs. Caveat emptor, as always. Next up is the Blackstar, the HT Club 40. It's a very popular amp these days. It makes a lot of the same promises that the modeling amps do, in that it has a lot of different sounds. The issue being that it has the same long-term reliability issues as the much less expensive modeling amps. So you're not going to get it new in warranty at this price point. You're going to be getting it used, which may be towards the end of its useful life, or you may buy one that's been sitting in someone's house for 6 months and it's still brand new. You're going to have to make that decision. I cannot really recommend the Blackstar because it is not reliable, it is not serviceable, it's much more expensive than the modelers. It costs about the same as the Marshall, has similar features to the Marshall, and the Marshall is a much better built amp. So we're going to strike the Blackstar off the list. That brings us to the Hot Rod Deluxe. Now, I chose the Hot Rod Deluxe versus the Hot Rod DeVille or the Blues Deluxe or Blues DeVille for 2 reasons. Number one, the Hot Rod Deluxe costs less than the various Hot Rod DeVilles, so it meets our $500 and under price point. Number two, I honestly think that the Deluxe circuit sounds better than the DeVille circuit. There are differences. And that the Hot Rod circuit sounds better than the Blues circuit. That said, with any of these, know that you're primarily buying a clean channel. Overdrive channel you can use, but it's not going to give you the sound of a Marshall. It's not going to give you a great high gain sound. It's just not. It does do a very good clean sound. That clean sound can be very loud. It has an abrupt transition from nothing to loud. You can tame that somewhat by using a 12AY7 instead of a 12AX for V1. And there are people on eBay and Reverb who will sell you a little box that you plug into the send and return, and it adds a master volume to the amp. And that's actually fine. They should have done it from the factory. It's just a little volume pot that you put in the effects loop and lets you have a master volume. If you need a really big, loud, clean sound and you want it to be tube, the Hot Rod is a very popular choice. Know that the Hot Rod Deluxe, like the DeVilles, like all the Blues amps, are prone to certain common failure modes. Number one, the filter caps leak. The filter caps don't last long. You will have to have them changed out at some point. Number two, the low voltage supply in these amps gets very hot and burns the board to the point where traces can be damaged and pads can lift off the board. This can be fixable, but it's something you need to know about. If you go to play one in person, because you're considering one, ask to take the rear panel off and look in this area that you can see in this video here, where you can see the discoloration from the other side. You can see if the caps have leaks. If they do, you might want to not buy that amp. Or if it's just beginning, you can take it to a tech and have that fixed and with new caps and the low voltage supply properly replaced with new components mounted off the board, the major failure points of this series can be taken off the table and the amp can last for decades. If you want to have that done, that's easily $350, assuming that nothing else is wrong with the amp. So your $500 purchase becomes an $800 amp if you want it to last. For that reason, I do not recommend the Hot Rod Deluxe. There are people out there who will think I'm crazy and will do it anyway. I hope that you're right and I'm wrong, but I would not bet on it. So now let's move to the Blues Junior, another very popular choice. Now the Blues Junior also has its heat woes. The amp has a non-adjustable fixed bias, and the Fender circuit has it set to stun. It absolutely kills EL84s. The heat that the two hot tubes generates damages the tube sockets where they're mounted. It damages the board in that area. The traces and the pads can be damaged. You can have a very expensive repair. Here's an excerpt of one. It's not an uncommon sight where someone had tried to fix it and had made it worse, and I had to end up replacing the entire board. At the same time, it's 15 watts, it's pretty loud, it's got a master volume, it's got a good clean sound, it's got a good light overdrive sound. People love these amps. They are the worst made amp on this list as far as being rugged. They have a very flimsy plastic input jack that breaks. The pot shafts are not actually attached to the chassis. They wobble. It's just little bits of plastic. I think when the Blues Junior came out 20 years ago, it was a pretty good choice. I don't think that it's a good choice anymore. Like the hot rods, these things can be fixed. The amp can be upgraded a little bit, but you're easily going to spend $200 to have that done. Maybe more if it needs a new board. Next up is the Vox AC15 Custom, the C1. There are two versions of this amp out there, the C1 and the C1X. The X just means that it has a blue Alnico speaker. The C1 without the X means that it has a greenback. Usually in this price range, you're going to get the one with the greenback. There is an eBay auction I found where someone had put a Weber Blue Dog in at the same price point. So there are good options out there, but the greenback sounds quite good. I'm talking about the Custom series, the newer one, not the slightly older Custom Classic series. I know it's confusing. The Custom Classic AC15 was not a very good amp. The AC30 Custom Classic was pretty good. The 15 not so much. With the new Custom series, the 15 is the same amp pretty much as its big brother, only it has fewer tubes, different transformers as a result, and it does not have the effects loop its big brother has. That said, it's a very good sounding, very reliable for its price point amp. I would say that as far as the construction quality goes, it is the best built amp in this list. It is the most rugged PCB. Everything at this price point is PCB. It is well laid out. It is not prone to systematic failures. You may encounter a bad screen resistor at some point. It's relatively easy to change those out. It's not likely to catch on fire. It's loud enough to be played with a drummer. It has a master volume for places where you don't want to be too loud. And if you're not familiar with the amp, it may surprise you. It's not just some little clean, jangly Beatles thing. Though I love the Beatles, and I love some clean, jangly stuff. All the sounds you can get are fairly versatile. It is not as versatile as the Marshall. It is not as versatile as the modelers. It's not designed to be. It does 2 or 3 really good sounds, and it does them well. It has built-in reverb, which is pretty good. It has built-in tremolo, which is pretty good. It does not have an effects loop. It and the Blues Junior are the only amps on this list that do not have an effects loop. It does take pedals in front of it very well, though. Of all the 2 amps on this list, the AC15 comes closest to sounding like its heritage. The Marshall sounds good. It has cosmetics that are reminiscent of older Marshalls. It doesn't sound like the older Marshalls. The 2 Fenders don't sound like historic Fender models, though they're old enough now that they are, in a way, their own historic model. But you cannot sound like a Deluxe Reverb or a Twin with a Hot Rod or a Blues Junior. You can sound very close to vintage Voxes with the AC15. Now, the AC15 in its current form is not a historic model. The old 60s JMI era AC15s were a very different amp with a Pinto channel and a tremolo channel. The current model AC15 Custom is really just a 15-watt version of an AC30. Both of those amps have a little more gain than the original circuit that inspired them, but they sound quite good. And for the price, if you don't need a whole lot of different sounds, you don't need an effects loop, and you don't need this and you don't need that, you just want one very good sounding amp, it can be hard to beat. And the last contender here is the Marshall DSL-40C. This is a very versatile amp. It has very good cleans. It has very good crunch tones. It has very good overdrives. It has very good distortions. Of the tube amps on this list, this is the only amp that would make you happy if you play metal. But you could also play jazz through it. Now, is it going to be the end-all, be-all high gain sound? No, not for under $500 used, but it is a very good sound. And you have a very good clean sound, a very good overdrive sound, etc., etc. You only have very basic effects within the amp, but you have an effects loop. So while it is not as versatile as the modelers on this list, it will last a lot longer than them. You may prefer the sounds to it, and you can always add effects before the amp or in the effects loop. If you're playing a top 40 gig or some other situation where you have a lot of covers and you need to get a lot of different sounds, the Marshall, the Blackstar, and the modelers are going to be the most appealing to you. Let's take the Blackstar out of the list because you have all the cons of a tube amp and all the cons of the solid state amps in one with the Blackstar, which leaves you with, say, the Line 6 or the Boss or this Marshall. There's a reason this Marshall costs closer to $1,000 new versus the brand new $500 modeling amps. You're going to get greater longevity, better build quality, and it's not going to go out of style. So if you're really looking for a lot of different sounds at this price point, it's a very attractive option. Personally, I prefer the sounds of the AC15, but I'm not trying to get a wide range of sounds out of one amp. If you are, the DSL-40C can be a very good choice, and it will hold its resale value. So if later you want to get something else, say, quote, a more authentic Marshall, you will not be throwing your money away. Whereas the modeling amps, you're not going to get that money back. You're just not. So here we are. We've reached the end. We have the final contenders. These four amps, the Katana and the Catalyst, the AC15, and the DSL-40C. All these amps are very good choices for a fairly reliable amp under $500. The two tube amps are much more reliable than the solid state amps. The solid state amps cost less. We've discussed all that. Now, I know that some people are screaming at me, what about this amp? What about that amp? I consider just about everything out there. Use PV Classic 50s, use PV Bandits. Some of the solid state Fenders from the late 80s can be quite good. I don't have time to do a list of why I did not choose specific amps. The older PVs are getting older. They're going to need service. PV as a company is falling apart. Their parts department is being shut down. They have specialty parts in those amps. Odds are you're not going to be able to get replacements down the road. That's just one, for instance. Number two, unless you are a tech, you don't know whether that amp that seems like a pretty good idea, it really is. These four, you're pretty much guaranteed to have a good result. The two on the left, the new ones, they'll have warranties. The two on the right, the tube amps, you're probably going to have to pick up in person, which means that you can play it first. You should. You should also give it an inspection as much as possible. Other people will be screaming at me just in general because I have two modeling amps and two amps with PCBs. Get real, people. We're talking under $500 in 2022. Things that used to cost $300 now cost $800. The world changes all the time. The next video, amps under $1,000, are going to have a lot more options. Some amps that'll make the purists more happy, some amps that are better built. I don't think we're going to have any modeling amps at that point. We'll talk about why when we get to that video. But for now, if you're looking for an amp in 2022 and you have $500, these are four good choices. Maybe all four of them intrigue you. Maybe you have no interest in the modeling. Maybe you have no interest in tubes. These are good choices. But again, $500 is not as much money as many of us think it is. So the choices for a good result are relatively limited. Once we get to the next level, under $1,000, there'll be a lot more crayons in our box. So look for that soon. And if you disagree with me, let the world know. The comment section awaits.